The entire trackside paddock turned to look the moment Rhett Calloway pulled through the gate, not because he arrived with fanfare or a convoy of branded support vehicles, but because he didn't. His truck was a faded Ford F-150 with a cracked side mirror, pulling a silver trailer that had seen better decades, and when he stepped out in a mechanic's jacket still carrying old grease stains, the crowd near the VIP barrier didn't know what to make of him. The boy beside him, maybe 10 years old, clutching a scuffed helmet under one arm like a trophy he hadn't won yet, looked around with wide eyes that didn't know enough to be embarrassed. Bryce Langston, standing near the Apex Dominion transporter in his $3,000 racing suit, tilted his head toward his crew chief and said something that made the group laugh. Across the paddock, Sterling Quinn straightened his cuffs and smiled at a nervous investor as if the joke had already been told and the punchline was already confirmed. And somewhere behind the tinted glass of the VIP hospitality suite, Celeste Mercer stood with her arms crossed and her eyes on the contract summary glowing on her tablet, knowing that the laughter down below had no idea what it had just bet against. Stay with this until the end, because the race they laughed at decided the future of an entire company. The Nevada desert in late October carried that particular quality of light that made everything look like a film still, flat, precise, unforgiving. The Velocity Trial had been running for 6 years as a closed-circuit performance event for electric vehicle manufacturers, a sanctioned proving ground where engineers could push prototype technology against real competition without the liability of a public road race. Bleachers had been erected along the front straight, and they were full. Sponsors had banners near the timing tower. Camera crews from 2 automotive trade outlets were already walking the pit lane, gathering, establishing shots before the first session. The air smelled like dust and ozone and something synthetic that came off the charging stations when multiple cars drew power at once. This was not a rough gathering of hobbyists. This was a professional event, insured and regulated and monitored, with medical staff positioned at 3 corners and a technical inspection team that had already passed every entered vehicle through a thorough safety review the previous evening. The 2 entries that mattered most to everyone in attendance were the Apex R12, representing Apex Dominion Racing, and the Mercer V9R, representing Mercer Velocity. Everyone already knew the Apex R12. It had come to the event on the back of a custom low loader, escorted by 3 chase vehicles, unloaded by a crew of 14 in matching kits, and immediately generated enough camera interest that the media briefing had to be moved to a larger tent. The Mercer V9R arrived inside Rhett Calloway's trailer, parked at the far end of the paddock, and was unloaded by Rhett, his son, and a young engineer named Piper Sloan, who'd driven down separately in a rented hatchback with 3 laptops and a box of energy drinks. Sterling Quinn made sure to stand near the investor group when this happened, gesturing subtly toward the contrast as if the optics alone were a verdict. Bryce Langston didn't bother with subtlety. He walked close enough to the Mercer setup to look at the V9R beneath its cover, studied the unremarkable trailer, looked at Nolan holding a ratchet wrench, and said loud enough to carry, "I thought they were sending a driver, not a father-son project." The people around him laughed. Nolan's jaw tightened. Rhett heard it and didn't look up from the tie-down strap he was releasing. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "People tend to bet with their mouths before they've seen the data." Celeste Mercer had not slept in 36 hours. Not because she was disorganized or unprepared, but because the weight of what she had arranged had finally settled fully on her chest somewhere around 3 in the morning and refused to leave. She was 41 years old, and she had been running Mercer Velocity for 9 of those years, inheriting a company her father had built from a small performance shop into a recognized name in American electric sport vehicles. The company still made excellent cars. The engineers still cared. But the market had moved fast and the capital markets had moved faster. And somewhere in the past 3 years, the gap between what Mercer could do and what the headlines said. Mercer could do had widened enough to become dangerous. The board was restless. 2 significant investors had already reduced their positions, and Apex Dominion, flush with overseas backing and a new platform built entirely around raw horsepower metrics, had been circling Mercer with acquisition language for the better part of a year. Celeste had refused every approach. But she understood what the numbers behind those approaches said. The contract on her tablet was not complicated. If the Mercer entry in the velocity trial outperformed the Apex entry across the tracked metrics, speed, energy efficiency, thermal stability, and lap time, a consortium of investors led by a firm called Hargrove Capital would commit the capital that would allow Mercer to operate independently, continue development, and move forward on its own terms. If the Mercer entry lost or failed to complete, the consortium would stand down, and the board had already pre-authorized the sale process. She had not told her wider team about the second condition. She had told Rhett. He had listened, asked 2 clarifying questions about the specific metrics being evaluated, and said, "Then let's make sure the car is ready." He hadn't asked about the money. He hadn't asked about the exposure. He hadn't flinched. That was the moment she had started to believe, for the first time, that she might have made the right call. Rhett Calloway had not grown up wanting to be famous. He had grown up wanting to understand things. As a child in southeastern Ohio, he had taken apart every appliance in the house that his parents had declared beyond repair. Toasters, VCRs, a riding mower that hadn't run in 4 summers, and understood intuitively that broken things were not failures. They were problems with specific causes and, usually, specific solutions. He studied mechanical engineering at a state university on a partial scholarship, supplemented by working weekends at an independent garage, and graduated without ceremony into a role as a junior test engineer at a mid-size automotive development firm. By 30, he was the lead validation engineer on a prototype electric drivetrain program at a company called Harlan Systems, responsible for high-speed performance testing, thermal load analysis, and what the team called edge case behavior, the part of the test matrix where everything that could go wrong was deliberately stressed until it either held or broke. He was not famous inside Harlan Systems, but he was trusted in the way that experienced engineers trust the one person who actually reads the full test report before signing it. The problem began with a vehicle designated the HS7 prototype. During thermal load testing at extended high output conditions, Rhett identified a pattern in the battery management data that concerned him, a progressive thermal creep that, under specific combinations of ambient temperature, charge state, and sustained demand, could trigger a protection shutdown at exactly the wrong moment. He documented it. He flagged it. He requested a delay to the planned demonstration event to allow the thermal management calibration to be revised. The program director declined. The event timeline was tied to a funding milestone, and the thermal issue, he was told, fell within acceptable parameters. Rhett did not believe it fell within acceptable parameters. He refused to sign the safety certification for the HS7. 3 days later, he was removed from the project and reassigned to a documentation role. 2 weeks after that, he resigned. The HS7 completed its demonstration without incident, and nobody outside Harlan Systems ever knew what Rhett had flagged or why he had left. His marriage did not survive the decision. His wife, a woman named Dana, who had been patient through most of the difficult years, told him she had tried to understand his principles and had failed to understand why principles always seemed to cost them money. The divorce was quiet and civil and left Rhett with primary custody of their son Nolan, who was 3 years old at the time. He moved to a small town in the Nevada high desert, bought a property with a large detached garage, and opened Callaway Auto Works. During the days, he fixed whatever people brought him. During the evenings, after Nolan was in bed, he worked on something he had never fully let go. A drivetrain control system he called the Callaway Vector Drive, a software and hardware integration that allowed electric motors to distribute torque dynamically across changing load conditions, specifically optimized for the kind of sustained high-performance demand that exposed the weaknesses of conventional systems. He wasn't building it to sell. He was building it because it was an unsolved problem, and unsolved problems had always been the thing he could not leave alone. Mercer Velocity had once occupied a position in the American automotive imagination that was difficult to replicate. A company small enough to move quickly, principled enough to build cars that engineers respected, and ambitious enough to believe that a domestic manufacturer could compete with international platforms on pure performance merit. Celeste had spent her first 4 years as CEO defending that position, and her last 5 years watching it erode. The causes were not simple. A major platform refresh had arrived 18 months late, delayed by supply chain disruptions that had hurt smaller manufacturers disproportionately. A competing vehicle from Apex Dominion had launched with marketing so aggressive and metrics so aggressively curated that it had dominated the conversation in the performance EV segment for 2 years, regardless of what independent testers actually found. And inside Mercer itself, there had been a quieter rot that Celeste had been too slow to identify. Sterling Quinn had joined the company as Chief Financial Officer 4 years earlier, recommended by a board member whose relationship with the Apex corporate structure Celeste had not fully mapped at the time. Sterling was skilled, organized, and persuasive, exactly the kind of CFO that boards liked and CEOs trusted. He presented data clearly, managed investor communications smoothly, and was reliably pessimistic about the company's independent future in a way that always seemed like prudent realism. What Celeste had not realized, and what Von Mercer, her attorney, was only beginning to piece together in the days before the Velocity trial, was that Sterling had been in communication with the Apex acquisition team for over a year. Not illegally, technically, but in ways that served Apex's interests by consistently framing Mercer's weaknesses as structural rather than correctable, and by positioning any failed attempt to remain independent as an inevitable outcome that only a sale could prevent. Sterling wanted a deal. He wanted it badly enough to quietly work against anything that might prevent one. When Celeste had brought Rhett Callaway into the program, bypassing the normal channels Sterling controlled, Quinn's response had been careful and contained. He had not objected directly. He had simply begun doing what he always did, shaping perception. He made sure that the word desperation appeared in 3 separate investor conversations in the week before the event. He made sure that Rhett's background as a garage mechanic was the first thing anyone searching for information about the Mercer entry would find. And 2 days before the trial, he had quietly requested a software configuration review from a member of the technical team. A review that, Piper Sloan would later discover, had resulted in 3 critical vector drive parameters being adjusted to values that would have degraded the system's thermal management performance under race conditions. Piper found the discrepancy on the morning of the event. She brought the printed data logs directly to Rhett. He looked at the altered parameters for a long moment, then said, "Lock the configuration and remove Sterling's credentials from the telemetry system." He said it without raising his voice. Then he and Piper spent 40 minutes restoring the correct values and running a verification sequence before the first practice session. Celeste was not told until later, but by the time Sterling realized the changes had been reversed, it was too late for him to do anything about it, without revealing that he had made them in the first place. The Mercer V9R did not look like a winner. That was, in some ways, by design, and in other ways, simply a consequence of being built by people who cared about what was inside it more than what was visible on the surface. The exterior carried the geometry of the Mercer platform that had been in development for the past 2 years, but the bodywork had not been finalized for production tolerances, which meant there were panel gaps in places a showroom car wouldn't have. And the paint was a flat gray primer that had been scuffed and marked by the testing program without anyone taking the time to refinish it. The interior was stripped to essentials: a single display cluster, a telemetry harness running along the driver's side, a racing seat that Rhett had sourced from a supplier he had worked with during his Harlan Systems days. From the outside, standing in the paddock next to the Apex R12's sculpted carbon bodywork and aggressive aero package, the V9R looked like a student project. Bryce Langston said as much to a camera crew that was gathering footage before the technical briefing. What was not visible from the outside was the drivetrain. The vector drive system used a paired motor configuration that had been recalibrated specifically for the V9R's weight distribution, and the tire compound Piper had selected based on the expected track temperature range. The thermal management architecture was different from anything Mercer had previously fielded. It prioritized sustained output over peak figures, which meant the car would never produce a single dramatic number that looked good in a slide deck, but would also never be forced to reduce power at a critical moment because the battery management system had decided self-preservation required it. The software layer was the part Rhett was most proud of. It read 12 data inputs every few milliseconds and adjusted torque split between the front and rear motors based on a predictive model that accounted for corner entry speed, steering angle, throttle position, and available thermal headroom. It was not an AI system in the marketing sense. It was an engineering system in the precise sense. A set of well-understood relationships expressed in code, tested exhaustively, and trusted because the person who had built it had also spent years finding the places where similar systems failed. Piper had worked with Rhett for 3 months to adapt the vector drive to the Mercer platform. She was 28 years old, had a master's degree in powertrain systems, and had joined Mercer 2 years earlier, believing the company was doing meaningful work. She had mostly been right. Working with Rhett had been the first time she felt the full depth of what meaningful work in that field could look like. He explained nothing twice if she paid attention the first time, never blamed the software when the problem was in the hardware, and had an ability to listen to a car, actually listen, with the engine running and his hand resting against the firewall, and identify something worth investigating that no diagnostic readout had flagged. On the morning of the race, after the parameters were restored and the verification complete, Piper stood beside the V9R and told Rhett she believed the system would hold. He nodded and said, "It'll hold. Make sure you're watching the thermal trace in the third sector. If Apex pushes too hard in the first two, that's where they'll show it." The velocity trial ran a format designed for meaningful comparison rather than spectacle. A 12-lap timed session on a permanent circuit, with each lap logged across 6 metrics. There were no standing starts. The format used rolling entries to eliminate launch variation and focus the evaluation on sustained performance. Both cars would run simultaneously, separated by a controlled gap at the start, with the order and margin at each intermediate timing point recorded. The crowd in the grandstands understood enough of this to follow the action, even if most of them had come as much for the social event as for the technical evaluation. When the session began and the Apex R12 accelerated away from the second position marker with a surge that the grandstands could feel rather than just hear, a wave of reaction ran through the crowd. Bryce Langston was an accomplished driver, and the R12 was built to be fast in a way that was immediately legible. Rapid, loud in its power delivery, visually assertive, the V9R followed at the prescribed gap. It accelerated differently, not slowly, but without the drama of the R12 pulling power through the corner exits in a way that was efficient rather than theatrical. To the untrained eye, in the first 2 laps, it looked like Rhett was being cautious. Bryce opened a margin of nearly 4 seconds by the end of the second lap. Sterling Quinn stood in the VIP area with his arms crossed and a barely concealed expression of satisfaction. 2 of the Hargrove Capital representatives exchanged a look that Celeste caught and chose not to react to. Nolan was standing beside Piper near the data station at the back of the pit garage. He watched the gap number increase and said nothing. Piper had one eye on the timing screen and one eye on the thermal telemetry that only the Mercer team could see. She watched the Apex R12's battery temperature trace climb steadily through the early laps, not dangerously but consistently in the pattern that Rhett had identified and predicted. She said to Nolan quietly, "Your dad's not behind. He's waiting." Nolan looked at the temperature numbers and at the gap number and worked something out in his head that a 10-year-old who had spent his life in a garage was probably better equipped to work out than most of the adults in the grandstands. He said, "He's going to wait until they have to slow down." Piper said, "Yes." In the third lap, the Apex R12's management system applied its first power reduction. Brief, partial, technically within the car's designed operating envelope, but visible in the lap time as a quarter-second degradation at a point in the circuit where Bryce had been consistently fast. Rhett closed the gap by half a second without appearing to change anything about his driving. He did not accelerate visibly harder. He simply maintained what he had been maintaining, and the gap came to him. Reagan Holloway had been covering the performance EV sector for 6 years, and she had learned to read investor behavior the way engineers read telemetry. Not for what it showed directly, but for what it implied. She had come to the velocity trial with a standard assignment: cover the technical evaluation, get quotes from both teams, file something interesting about the competitive landscape. She had noticed Sterling Quinn's behavior before the session started. She had noticed the way Celeste Mercer moved through the event, present, but somehow braced, with a quality of attention that went beyond normal executive interest in a marketing demonstration. During the fourth lap, while the V9R was beginning its methodical reduction of the apex margin, Reagan moved through the VIP area and found Vaughn Mercer standing near the hospitality entrance with a phone in his hand and an expression she recognized as controlled urgency. She asked him a direct question. Was there a binding outcome condition attached to the Mercer entry in this event? He paused long enough to tell her everything she needed to know. He said, "You should ask Celeste." She found Celeste near the timing wall, watching the sector displays with a stillness that cost her something to maintain. Reagan asked the question without preamble. Had Celeste committed the future of Mercer Velocity to the result of this race? Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If the V9R wins today, Hargrove Capital funds the next phase and we move forward. If it loses, the board has authorized a sale process." She said it evenly, the way someone says a thing they have already made peace with, even though they haven't. Reagan took a breath and said, "And you put Rhett Calloway in the car." Celeste said, "I put the best person for this specific problem in the car." The conversation lasted 4 more minutes and would become the basis of a piece that would run within 24 hours of the session's conclusion. What it did immediately was change the atmosphere in the VIP area when people began to understand what they were watching. The laughter from the first hour of the event had a specific quality. It came from people who believed they already knew the outcome and were enjoying their certainty. What replaced it was something harder to name. Not silence exactly, but a quality of attention that was different from entertainment. Several of the investors who had been monitoring the timing screens with mild interest began watching more carefully. A group of engineers from 2 separate firms who had been treating the event as a social occasion moved closer to the pit wall. Sterling Quinn's expression, when word of what Celeste had said reached him, was no longer satisfaction. He moved toward the pit lane entrance and tried to reach the Mercer crew chief by radio to request that the car be brought in for a precautionary check. Piper answered the radio. She said, reading from the telemetry in front of her, "All systems nominal, thermal within target range. There are no grounds for an unscheduled stop." She released the channel. Rhett, in the car, heard none of this. He was 4 seconds behind Bryce Langston with 6 laps remaining, and the Apex R12's thermal trace had just posted its second significant reduction event in a single lap. The way Rhett had always understood competitive performance was not as a contest of maximums, but as a contest of management. Anyone could build a car that was fast when everything went perfectly. The engineering problem, the real one, was building a car that was fast when things were not perfect, when the ambient temperature was 3 degrees higher than expected, when the circuit surface was gritty after an overnight wind, when the driver's line through a technical section was 2 feet wide of ideal and the torque split had to compensate in real time rather than after the fact. The vector drive had been built around this understanding. It did not produce the most dramatic single-lap number. It produced the most consistent sequence of numbers across an extended run. Lap 7 was where the gap began to close in a way that was visible to everyone. The Apex R12 came through the first sector with a split that was noticeably slower than its early pace. Not catastrophically, but measurably, the product of a management system that was working harder to protect the battery than to power the car. Bryce was a skilled enough driver to know what was happening and skilled enough to try to compensate by finding the tenths elsewhere on the circuit. Pushing harder through the long right-hander in the second sector, where the R12's aero package was theoretically strongest. He found some of it. But the V9R in that same corner was doing something different. The vector drive was distributing torque across both axles in a way that allowed Rhett to carry more speed through the exit without the rear end stepping out, which meant he was at full acceleration earlier than Bryce on every lap, compounding a small advantage over 12 repetitions into something that the timing screens could not be misread. By lap 9, the gap was under a second. The grandstands, which had been the source of some of the crueler commentary earlier in the day, were now almost entirely silent except for the sound of the cars. Nolan was standing at the pit wall monitor with both hands gripping the top of the barrier, not breathing particularly well. Piper was narrating the telemetry to no one in particular. Heat margins, split deltas, the state of charge curves for both vehicles running side by side on her left screen. Celeste had stopped watching the VIP monitors and moved to a position where she could see the circuit directly. She was standing close enough to the pit wall that she could hear the V9R's motor note changing pitch through the corners. A clean, controlled sound that was nothing like the aggressive assault of the R12. Sterling Quinn had stopped communicating with anyone on the Mercer team. Vaughn had found the email thread on a shared system that morning and had spent the last hour compiling it into a summary document. He sent it to Celeste's phone at the start of lap 10 with a single line of text that read, "Read when you have a moment." The Sterling situation is documented. She read it in 40 seconds while standing at the pit wall and handed the phone back to Vaughn without changing her expression. Lap 10 was where Rhett caught him. Not on the straight. Bryce was still faster there, the R12's raw output numbers marginally superior on a flat surface with no thermal constraint active. It happened in the complex sequence in the third sector. 4 corners that required 3 direction changes in just over 400 meters. A section that rewarded what Rhett's old test notes had always called system coherence, meaning the ability of every component to work together without any single element becoming the limiting factor. The vector drive was built for this. As Bryce defended wide through the first element of the complex, protecting the inside for the following left-hander, Rhett found a line that nobody in the grandstands expected, because nobody watching thought the V9R had the mechanical grip to sustain it. A tighter entry with a later apex, trusting the system to manage the torque distribution through the exit, rather than waiting until the car was fully straight to apply power. It worked the way it worked in his garage tests, the way it worked in every simulation Piper had run, the way it worked because the 3 months of calibration that had gone into it were the product of someone who had spent years understanding exactly where these systems failed and had designed around every one of those failure modes. The V9R cleared the fourth element of the complex a car length clear of the R12 and carried that advantage onto the back straight. The grandstands broke. Not immediately. There was a 2-second delay as the crowd processed what it was seeing, and then the response was loud and disorganized, the kind of noise that comes when a room full of people who had committed to a certain outcome is forced to revise it without warning. Nolan screamed his father's name. Piper was crying and reading the data simultaneously, which she would later describe as the strangest professional experience of her life. Bryce Langston held the R12 at everything it could give him through the final 2 sectors, and Rhett gave him nothing back. 2 laps remained. The gap held, lap 11, the gap held, final lap. Bryce pushed hard enough through the closing sequence to make the result uncomfortable to watch. The R12's management system gave him slightly more headroom in the closing laps because the thermal demand was dropping as the session neared its end. And there was a moment entering the final straight where the 2 cars were close enough that several people in the grandstands who had been watching the timing screens instead of the circuit believed Bryce was going to take it on the line. He didn't. The V9R crossed the timing beam first by 1.4 seconds. The scoreboard updated. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then everything in the paddock that had a voice used it. Rhett was still in the car when Nolan reached him. He had pulled to a stop at the end of the pit lane, completed the shutdown sequence. Battery isolation, data logging confirmation, system archive, with the same deliberate attention he gave to every shutdown, as if the car deserved the correct procedure regardless of what had just happened. When he opened the door and climbed out, Nolan was already there. Rhett went to one knee on the asphalt and held his son for a long time. He didn't wave to the grandstands. He didn't look for cameras. He wasn't being humble about it. He simply had a different order of priorities. And the person who had watched every lap from the pit wall while holding a ratchet wrench and trying to look calm was the first one those priorities led him to. Piper got to him next, still holding a data tablet with a live telemetry trace on the screen, and managed to say approximately 3 coherent words before giving up on coherence entirely. The results were already being read over the circuit PA. The V9R had not only turned the fastest lap of the session, it had posted the most consistent sequence of thermal readings, the lowest variance in lap time across the 12 laps, and the highest state of charge at the finish of any car in the event's history. It had not been the fastest car. It had been the most complete one. Celeste came to the paddock. She had walked from the VIP area with the kind of pace that suggested the CEO composure was still engaged but only just, and when she reached Rhett and found him talking to Nolan about something related to the 3rd sector that the boy had apparently been watching on the data screen, she waited until they had finished. Then she said, "You saved the company." Rhett said, "The car saved the company." "Your engineers gave the car something worth saving." Celeste said, "I need you to know, when you first showed up here, I didn't fully believe." She said it directly, the way someone says a thing they have already decided they owe. Rhett looked at her for a moment and said, "That's all right. You believed enough to sign the contract. Most people don't get that far." Bryce Langston came across the paddock at some point during this and shook Rhett's hand. He said the car was better than he'd expected and the driving was clean. It was not a long conversation, but it was a real one. Not every opponent becomes a cartoon. Sterling Quinn did not come across the paddock. By the time the final results were posted, Vaughn had reached Celeste with a summary of the documented communications. She suspended Sterling's access and authorized a formal internal review before the event was over. No cameras caught it. No announcements were made. The investors from Hargrove Capital found Celeste near the timing tower and confirmed the commitment. The deal was done quietly in the way that consequential things are often done, not in the room where everyone is watching, but in a brief exchange between people who have already read the documents. Mercer Velocity was not being sold. The media attention in the hours after the session was something Rhett had not fully planned for. He answered questions for about 30 minutes before telling the crew that he needed to take care of the car, which was true, and retreated to the trailer with Nolan and Piper. Reagan Holloway found him there and asked one final question. What did he want people to understand about what had happened today? He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I'm a mechanic. People in this industry tend to believe you when the machine works, not before. That's fine. I'm used to proving things through the hardware." Reagan asked if it bothered him that he'd had to prove it here, like this, in front of people who had made their opinion of him clear before the first lap. He said, "The opinion didn't change anything about the car." In the days that followed, the internal review at Mercer moved quickly. Sterling Quinn's communications with the Apex acquisition team were documented, reviewed by outside counsel, and determined to represent a conflict of interests significant enough to constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. Quinn resigned before he could be formally terminated. He would spend the following year in conversations with lawyers. Apex Dominion issued a brief public statement congratulating Mercer on its performance at the Velocity trial and noting that the company looked forward to continued competition in the marketplace. The statement was read by most people in the industry as a retreat, which it was. Celeste asked Rhett to come to San Francisco for a meeting with her board and the Hargrove team. He came, but he drove himself, and he brought Nolan, who sat in the waiting area reading a book about internal combustion engines that he had already read twice. The offer on the table was significant, a licensing arrangement for the vector drive technology, a technical consulting role at a compensation level that Rhett had not earned in any previous year of his working life, and an invitation to serve as the company's director of performance validation. The person who signed off on whether a car was ready. Rhett took the meeting seriously and the offer seriously. He came back with conditions, typed on a single page, that he had written at the kitchen table of his house the evening before. The conditions were these. The vector drive technology would be licensed under terms that preserved Mercer's right to develop it, but required the engineering team that had built it to be credited and included in all derivative development. A safety reporting protocol would be implemented giving Piper Sloan's team direct escalation authority without passing through the CFO's office. The assembly facility in Nevada would be maintained for a minimum of 5 years, protecting the employment of the manufacturing staff. A portion of the licensing revenue would fund a skills training program for young mechanics and technical workers, structured without corporate branding requirements, and Rhett's schedule would be organized to allow him to be home with Nolan on school nights and available for his son's life in the ways that mattered. Celeste read the conditions in the meeting. She agreed to all of them. Then she said, "I also want to apologize, not for business reasons, because I judged you by what I saw in the parking lot instead of what was in your trailer." Rhett said, "The judgment cost you one night's sleep. It didn't cost the race." He said it without edge. He wasn't holding anything against her. He was simply being accurate. She had ultimately made the right call, and he had honored it, and now the question was whether the next chapter would be built on something more solid than the assumptions they'd both had to overcome to get here. He thought it could be. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way that racing paddocks are dramatic. They were dramatic in the way that genuine organizational change is dramatic, slow, resistant to narrative tidiness, reliant on the patience of people who understand that institutions change at the speed of trust rather than the speed of announcements. Mercer Velocity relaunched its development program with the V9R as the technical foundation. The production version, designated the V9 for public release, would carry a revised form of the vector drive as its primary differentiating feature. The marketing language for it, which Celeste personally reviewed and revised, did not describe the car as revolutionary or game-changing or any of the other words that meant nothing to engineers. It described it as the most thermally stable performance electric vehicle in its class, which was something that could be demonstrated with published test data, and was. Piper Sloan was promoted to Director of Safety and Systems Engineering. She built a team of 7, hired 2 of them directly out of technical programs at community colleges, and established a testing protocol that required every performance claim to be verified under sustained load conditions, not just peak ones. The protocol was named, internally, the Callaway Standard. No announcement was made about the name. It was simply what people at Mercer called it. Sterling Quinn's departure and the circumstances around it became known within the industry, as these things always do. No one was surprised for long. People in these industries tend to file certain stories in the category of should have known once the information is available. The Apex Dominion acquisition conversation ended. Their attention moved elsewhere. Reagan Holloway's article ran under the headline, "The Mechanic They Bet Against Just Saved a Car Company," and was shared broadly enough to reach people who did not ordinarily read automotive trade coverage. Several of them were investors. Several of them were engineers at companies that were not Mercer. Several of them were mechanics in small shops, in places where the story felt personal in a way that didn't require explanation. Rhett read the article once, at his kitchen table, then set his phone down and went back to the transmission he was rebuilding for a customer who had brought it in 3 weeks earlier. Callaway Auto Works was still open. He had upgraded the diagnostic equipment and added a small enclosed bay that he used for vector drive calibration work, but the front of the shop looked the same as it always had: a hand-painted sign, 2 lift bays, a parts shelf that required organizational principles the customers never saw. Nolan was in the shop most afternoons after school, doing whatever Rhett trusted him to do, which expanded by increments as he got older and more careful. He had stopped telling kids at school about the race. Not because he was embarrassed, but because he had found that the people who understood it already understood it, and the people who didn't weren't interested in the part that actually mattered, which was not the winning lap but the 11 laps before it, where his father had held the car inside what it could sustain, while everyone else was watching for something faster. Celeste came to the shop in November, 4 months after the Velocity trial. Not for a meeting. The meetings happened by video call and in conference rooms, but because she had said she would, and she had learned, from Rhett and from the year she'd had, that the value of saying, "You will do something," is in the doing. She drove herself, arrived without assistance, and found Rhett in the far bay showing Nolan the correct torque sequence for a set of wheel bolts. She watched them for a moment before either of them noticed her. When Rhett looked up, she said, "I was in the area." He said, "No, you weren't." She said, "No. I came to see how you were doing." They talked for an hour, standing in the shop, while Nolan eventually wandered off to read something on the laptop Piper had given him with a set of simulation exercises loaded on it. At the end of the conversation, Celeste looked at the V9R prototype sitting in the corner bay, parked next to a rusted station wagon with a broken timing belt and a pickup truck waiting on brake work, and said, "I keep thinking about how that looks. The car that saved the company, next to all the ones nobody's heard of." Rhett said, "They're all someone's car. They all deserve to run right." She thought about that for a moment, then said, "I think I came here to tell you that I understand something I didn't before. I thought I was betting on a driver. I was actually betting on the person who knew the car well enough to tell me when it was ready and mean it." Rhett wiped his hands on a shop cloth and looked at the two vehicles standing side by side, the prototype and the pickup, and said nothing for a moment. Outside, the desert light was doing the thing it did in late afternoon, going flat and honest and uninterested in the difference between famous and unknown. He said, "That's what mechanics do." They had bet the single dad mechanic would lose because he didn't look like someone who wins. But the CEO had already read the data, staked the company on what it said, and the man who knew the car better than anyone else in that paddock brought it home exactly the way he said he would. Not by being faster than what they expected, but by being more prepared than they were willing to believe.